Thank you very much, Israel, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to try to share my, you see, my slides here. Okay, I think it works. And
Yes, it's working.
can you see it?
Yes,
And
perfect.
Is it moving? Okay. Sometimes the slides are not moving, so I'm just checking it. Okay, thank you very much, Israel. And I know that your research project is about the diffusion of climate acts, but I'm not going to talk about climate acts, but as we agreed beforehand, give maybe an introduction to the research that has been done and can be done in the future on the international diffusion of environmental policies. And I'm going to introduce a little bit where this diffusion research comes from, and then try to define what is meant by diffusion, and then also focus on some of the typical research questions that are prominent in this research agenda. So okay, here we go. These are just a few titles of research on environmental policy diffusion and policy diffusion in general, just to give you an idea that there's a whole research agenda behind this. I think it reached one of its high points 10 years ago at the 54th annual convention of the International Studies Association, where this huge conference was called The Politics of International Diffusion, Regional and Global Dimensions. So this is a research agenda that has produced a lot of research, not only in environmental policy, but also in all kinds of areas of public policy and international governance. The starting point of this research was a long time ago in the 1990s, when researchers who were working on comparative environmental policy or comparative politics in general found out that there was an increasing similarity of national environmental policies. So basically, you were looking from a national perspective and thinking that most of the determinants of policy making at the national level were national governments, parties in parliament, national interest groups, national problem structures, etc. But what comparative research found was that there was a lot of similarity. So domestic policy institutions like ministries, policy instruments, laws, regulations for environmental protection over time became increasingly similar across many countries. And this research initially focused a lot on OECD countries, on the Western industrialized countries. On the right hand, you see a graph on access to environmental information laws, where you can see that in 45 countries that my colleague Per-Olof Busch and I looked at, you can see a slow, very slow adoption of this kind of laws in the beginning, and then a steep rise. And by the year 2005, almost all countries in this sample of OECD countries and Eastern European countries, you could see that almost all these countries had such a policy in place. So we can see this in all kinds of areas of environmental policy. We can see that the similarity of policies increases, and that different countries adopt similar policies increasingly over time. So the starting point here was to try to find out what explains this increasing similarity of environmental policies over time and across countries. And of course, first of all, people started looking at international factors like the multilateral cooperation within binding environmental agreements. So countries negotiate and agree upon international agreements that then become binding for all the countries that ratify these agreements. And the previous image, you can see that the access to environmental information was mainly the result of an international agreement, the Aarhus Convention on Access to Environmental Information in Europe. Um, and then a second factor was external coercion or imposition. So here we have individual states or international organizations who use their political, their military, or their financial power to coerce weaker states into adopting certain policies. A good example here is, for example, the accession of new member states to the European Union. And if they want to join the European Union, what they have to do is um, to transpose into national law all the existing secondary law of the European Union. Also, conditions linked to loans or development aid by international organizations like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund are examples of this coercion. And then there's also the hypothesis that all countries are facing the same problems and they're just reacting individually without any interaction to the same problems. And they all come up with the same solutions to these problems, which is not very probable, but of course we have to take this into account. So basically, we were looking at what international relations is about international organizations, international agreements, and how they can affect the national domestic policy making. But then we saw that this is often not the case, and often we get this increasing similarity in the absence of national agreements or in the absence of processes of coercion. And so basically, what we looked at was the literature on policy diffusion, which argues which has a basic assumption that countries who are confronted with environmental problems look to what other countries are doing in order to learn what best practices are out there and how they can learn from the experience of other countries or other jurisdictions. We can look at municipalities, we can look at federal states. It doesn't have to be nation states. And so there has been a literature in the general policy literature that has looked at processes of lesson drawing, of policy learning, of emulation, and more generally on cross-national policy transfer. So when we saw the empirical evidence that there was a lot of similarity without international binding agreement, we started looking at this kind of literature that was there on policy transfer, lesson drawing, policy learning, policy emulation. And the basic definition of policy transfer is that this is a process by which knowledge about policies or administrative arrangements or institutions and ideas in one political system is used in the development of policies, etc., in other political systems. And in this kind of literature on policy transfer, mostly the level of analysis has been the individual jurisdiction, the individual city, municipality, individual country, etc. Then we also looked into another literature, which was the literature on policy diffusion. While policy transfer looks at bilateral transfers between one and another jurisdiction, the policy diffusion literature starts from the assumption that bilateral policy transfers hardly ever occur in isolation. And very often, innovative policies are emulated or imitated by a large number of countries, states, or municipalities. If you look at a highly interdependent world system like ours, you can see that policies that are considered best practices or good practices can rapidly spread globally, or maybe also within regions like Europe or Latin America, among the countries in this region. So when we look at lots of cases of policy transfer from a macro level perspective, then we look at a dynamic that is called policy diffusion. That's a dynamic of how individual instances of policy transfer or policy adoption reinforce each other and create cascades of policy transfer and patterns, general patterns of policy adoption among a group of countries or sometimes all the countries worldwide. So the dependent variable is not individual adoptions, but general patterns of policy adoption across political systems. And if you're looking at the diffusion of climate acts in Latin America, for example, your universe of countries, of cases, are the states in the countries in the region. And you're not only looking at how one country learns from one other country, but you will also be looking at the general dynamics that evolve when more and more countries adopt a certain climate act, when they change characteristics of these climate acts, and how this cascade of policy transfers then works out. So how do we define policy diffusion? Well, generally, there was a very early research on policy diffusion among the US American states by Jack Walker. He published his first article in 1969. And he looked at diffusion as spatial patterns of adoption of new programs. So the big theoretical contribution here by Walker was to argue that domestic policy adoptions, domestic policy adoptions are not only influenced by internal factors, but highly dependent on the previous policy decisions of other states or other countries or other political units. And basically, this dynamic that was then reinforced by a very famous definition by Beth Simmons and colleagues, who defined policy diffusion as when government policy decisions in a given country are systematically conditioned by prior policy choices made in other countries. So what we're looking at is a dynamic where the adoption of a policy in one country changes the probability that a similar policy will be adopted by other countries. The more countries are adopting a policy, the stronger the dynamic, and the more probably it gets that the remaining countries will also adopt this policy. So this is the general logic of policy diffusion and policy diffusion research. And in the environmental field, there have been lots of diffusion studies since the 1990s. The environmental policy domain has been one of the fields where these dynamics have been studied and analyzed and have been most prominent. So from an international perspective, there's been a lot of research by John Meyer and colleagues who looked at the creation of national environmental ministries, of environmental laws, and also of intergovernmental environmental organizations, and interpreted this as important elements of the emergence and the structuring of a world environmental regime. At the same time, scholars of comparative environmental policy analysis, and especially at the Environmental Policy Research Center in Berlin at the Free University of Berlin, with Martin Jennicke and other colleagues, where I was also working and doing research for about 10 years. Um, we found that these processes of imitation and learning from foreign models were a key driver of domestic environmental policy change and resulted in cross-national patterns of environmental policy change. And based on this research, Per Olof Busch and I have defined environmental policy diffusion as a process by which environmental policy innovations are communicated in the international system and adopted voluntarily by an increasing number of countries or subnational jurisdictions over time. So basically, the main elements here are the communication that a certain policy exists, a certain policy innovation is possible, and the voluntary decision by individual countries, but a succession of countries to adopt similar policies. So it's not a centralized top-down process where we have countries who get together to negotiate the solution to a problem, but it's a decentralized and somewhat horizontal process where it is not very clear who the main actors are, because the policy, that diffusion pattern emerges from a lot of individual decentralized decisions. So here's just some of the empirical research that has been done on environmental policy diffusion. I'm not going to go into detail, but maybe an interesting study is the one of the diffusion, the last one here in the list, the diffusion of anti-plastic shopping bag policies, which Jennifer Clapp and colleagues worked on. And what they found was that there was a policy diffusion pattern that didn't go from the north, the global north, to the global south, but it started in the global south in developing countries like Bangladesh, and then diffused to other countries, coming to US states and the European Commission and many European Union member states. So usually we look at these environmental policy diffusions as a process from the global north to the global south, and what they looked at was a process where policies diffused from the south to the north. A very interesting pattern here. Now, let me come to some of the research topics in the study of environmental policy diffusion. A first set of questions relates to how knowledge about innovative policies travels across countries or among municipalities or cities, etc. So we're looking at the channels of diffusion, or the communication channels that lie at the basis of the communication, or the knowledge transfer about innovative policies. And here we can look at, in the beginning, everybody looked at transfer between neighboring countries. So the idea was that countries who share a border and who also share other, most often cultural or language ties, they will be most prone to learning from each other. But then quickly these studies found out that information doesn't travel slowly across borders, but information is centralized and travels internationally. And so very quickly they found out that there were actually individual states who acted as worldwide reference points for a particular type of environmental policy. For example, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the Netherlands were a reference for environmental policy planning, for goal-oriented approaches to environmental policy making. So this led us also to the question of the role of pioneers and leaders. One of the questions also always, who are the countries that are pioneering a diffusion pattern in a given region of the world or globally? who are the leaders and who are the countries who are following behind or maybe not following at all. Um, the focus is also on the role of policy entrepreneurs who can spread the word about policy innovations. Often, the theory of policy entrepreneurs argues that there are countries or there are actors, they don't have to be countries, there are actors who favor a certain policy solution and then try to uh, um, spread the word about this policy solution to governments all over the world. The role of international non-governmental organizations is important. For example, in the field of renewable energy policy, the REN 21 is an organization that is sharing information about best practice and sharing information about policy adoptions in the field of energy transition and climate policies. International organizations, IOs, are also important here. The OECD has been important as a benchmark setter with their environmental performance reviews. And then we also can see that transnational issue-specific policy networks, for example, the international network of cities for local environmental, local climate initiatives, or epistemic communities are also structures where the information about innovative policies travels from one country to another. So this is one of the questions, channels of diffusion, communication channels. A second set of question relates to the causal mechanisms of policy diffusion. So if you look at mechanisms, you're looking at recurring processes which link certain causes to certain effects. So it's a question about what causes the country when they about a policy innovation to actually adopt this policy. You know, knowledge doesn't automatically translate into action. So the focus on mechanisms is why do some countries um, use this information in order to adopt similar policies and others maybe not? Why in some cases we find policies that are adopted by many countries quickly and other policies that are not adopted by many countries. So how does knowledge about a policy of one country affects the decision to adopt this policy in another? And basically, there are three mechanisms of policy diffusion that have been identified in the literature. They are learning, imitation, and competition. Learning, I already talked about this, it occurs when national decision makers search for effective solutions to pressing national problems, and especially when domestic policymakers have little time or face great uncertainties about which policy alternative will be best to solve a problem. They may just decide to model their own policy choices on those of countries that are generally perceived as being successful. Um, and sometimes persuasion also helps when international organizations promote a certain policy and try to convince countries to adopt this policy. This may accelerate learning processes. By contrast, if you look at imitation, or synonym is emulation, we find that this becomes more frequent during the later stages of diffusion processes when a policy innovation has already been adopted by a bigger number or significant number of countries. And imitation is defined as a process where policies diffuse because of their normative and socially constructed properties instead of their objective characteristics. So countries are not necessarily looking only for an effective solution to an environmental problem, but maybe they also simply want to conform to international norms of appropriate behavior, appropriate governance, or be seen as a legitimate country, increase their own internal legitimacy in the eyes of other countries. So basically, here we have a norm-driven behavior where people, where countries adopt a certain policy because they think this is the good thing to do. And then a third mechanism is competition. And here we have two types of competition. One is quite well known. It's the economic competition, where states change their internal policies strategically in order to improve their international competitiveness. And for example, in the environmental field, we see a lot of trading up, where governments raise their own national product standards, environmental product standards, in order to comply with the more ambitious regulations in foreign markets. For example, David Vogel calls this the California effect, where the decision by the US state of California to only allow for for cars or vehicles with who conform to strict emission standards to be sold. This led other countries who are also automobile producers to press their own industry, car industry, to comply with these norms in order to be able to access in the future the Californian vehicle or automobile market. But there's also a political competition, which occurs when states try to adopt early on new policies in order to influence posterior international agreements. So basically, the idea here is if we are the first ones to opt for a policy, or among the first ones, then there's a big chance that this policy will also become the international political standard and will be the contents of international agreements. And this then means that a country doesn't have to adapt to policies that they haven't chosen in the first place. So here's a political competition about influence on posterior international or multilateral agreements that may appear in the field of environmental policy. Third topic, which is becoming more and more important, is whether policy diffusion actually, on a global level, contributes to the solution of environmental problems, contributes to a concerted, coordinated response of the countries at the international level to pressing problems. And the idea here is that that if you can't reach agreement in multilateral agreements, multilateral negotiations, if international negotiations fail or postpone from one year to another, like we have seen a lot of time in the climate realm, then maybe these decentralized and horizontal diffusion processes are a good substitute for centralized and negotiated cooperation and problem solving among states. And so basically, the big question here is, on the one hand, whether diffusion can be conceived of as a mechanism of global environmental governance. And if so, whether the results of diffusion processes are comparable to the results of multilateral agreements and international institutionalized cooperation between countries. And here my colleague Per-Olof Busch and I, we did some research. We had 21 policy innovations here, the most different policies over time from 1945 until 2005. And we looked at the proliferation, the spread of these policy innovations. And we looked at, on the one hand, and you see that on the epsilon, the left axis, we looked at how many countries in the end of the period under observation had actually adopted such a policy. And on the axis to the right, we looked at the speed of proliferation, of how these policies spread. internationally. And then we tried to identify which was the mechanism of their spread, whether it was the voluntary and decentralized mechanisms of diffusion that we describe as diffusion, or whether it was international agreements, or whether it was independent, uncoordinated problem solving, etc. And what we found was that there were a lot of policy innovations, like the creation of environmental ministries and agencies, sustainability commissions, environmental framework laws, feed-in tariffs for renewable electricity, environmental impact assessments, and others, where these soft mechanisms of voluntary diffusion played a very crucial role, a major role in the diffusion, and the other mechanisms like intergovernmental negotiations weren't that important. And then we had some other policies where we saw a minor role of diffusion, so it played a role, but eventually, in most of these cases, after an initial period of voluntary spread, voluntary diffusion, there was an international agreement. So the international agreement basically substituted the softer diffusion process. And here we looked at environmental advisory councils, laws on access to environmental information, which spread first through diffusion, and then we had the Aarhus Convention, which institutionalized this and made it binding at the international level. And we have equal labels, energy labels, and other factors where we have in parallel diffusion and multilateral agreement processes which occur in parallel. So basically, what we saw here is that yes, this decentralized voluntary diffusion dynamics, they can actually be substitute for the more top-down and more coercive governance modes that we usually talk about when we talk about international global policy making or regional policy making also. So what would be, to get to the end of my presentation, what would be topics for future research on environmental policy diffusion? And I'm only naming three here. I'm sure there's a lot more, and I could also come up with more, but I'm just gonna stick to three. First of all, we still know relatively little about processes of environmental policy transfer and diffusion among non-OECD countries, or also their sub-national units like states and cities. And while we see, well, there's an assumption, a general assumption in the diffusion literature of normal north-south dynamic. There may be differences, and there may be also other patterns like the plastic bag prohibition pattern that starts in the south and then goes on to the global north. So there's not enough systematic empirical research about whether different types of countries, OECD and non-OECD, or the different regions of the world, whether they develop different diffusion dynamics. So I think your research on climate acts in Latin America can contribute to developing such a regional perspective on diffusion dynamics in the environmental and climate field. Linked to this, it would be interesting to see whether the diffusion processes in different areas of the world differ with relation, for example, to communication channels, whether there are differences in the, for example, in Europe, in the European Union, we have a very strongly institutionalized system of communication, of policies, of information exchange, and also the possibility of top-down harmonization of policies among the EU member states. In other countries or in other regions of the world, the institutional density is not as high as in Europe or in Western Europe, and so maybe there are differences. Maybe there are functional alternatives to this high institutional density at the intergovernmental level. Also, it would be interesting to see if causal mechanisms are different and if there are, for example, intervening factors that can accelerate or slow down or even block diffusion processes in other regions that is not Europe, and also in groups of countries that include OECD and non-OECD countries, like in Latin America, and not like in Europe, where Western Europe, where almost all the countries are OECD member states since the very beginning for a long time. And then it would be interesting to know which factors influence the speed and also the scope of environmental policy diffusion processes. And if we know which factors influence the speed and scope, then the question arises whether we can use this knowledge to increase the effectiveness of policy diffusion as a mechanism of international environmental governance. So if we argue that in fields where international multilateral agreement is hard to reach, that then diffusion processes are a functional equivalent or a substitute or plan B for the failure of global governance, of global environmental governance, then it would be interesting if there's anything that individual actors within the region can do in order to accelerate or raise the probabilities and the speed of policy adoption during diffusion processes. So these are only three topics that could be interesting for further research, and I'm going to stop here and thank you all for listening, and then I'll be happy to discuss with you anything that I said or that is relevant for your project, your research that is upcoming now. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Helge, for this very insightful presentation. I think that you have given us a lot of food for thought. And since we have a lot of scholars from very different geographies, and this is a project with a regional perspective, I would like to open the floor for a Q&A. I don't know if any of our guests, our invited scholars or students that are present here, they want to start with the questions, or otherwise I have, as a moderator, I also have some questions to our to Helge. So I don't know if anyone want to start, or okay, please, Jose Manuel Leal. He's a colleague from Universidad de Guadalajara. I'm very happy you are also here with us, Jose Manuel. So welcome, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Israel. And thank you, Helge. It was quite interesting. I have just one simple question. The impact or the influence of this term in public policy literature of functional interaction in the diffusion process of public policies. I don't know if you could give me some thoughts about it.
Sorry, what do you mean with functional interaction?
Yeah, there's this concept about functional interaction, how the coordination between different actors from different nature help in the process of policy making.
Okay. Well, basically, there's a lot of topics that are really relevant and which you can't address in such a brief overview of the research agenda, but basically the actors and the interaction between actors at different levels of governance is one of the main issues here. And so we have to look always, when we will look at individual instances of policy diffusion, we we will look at actors at the international level, and those can be state and non-state actors, of course. And we will also look at actors at the national level who may be in favor or want to obstruct the adoption of a given policy. And what is important here is that this logic of diffusion, that the prior adoption policy by another country or several other countries changes the probability of domestic adoption in those countries that haven't done so yet. This logic has a lot to do with changing also the power and the influence of actors who are proponents or opponents of a policy. So if you're an NGO and you want your country to adopt a national climate act, then you can, of course, say we need a national climate act. That's great. But you can also say, well, all our neighboring countries already have a national climate act, and we are the only country that doesn't have one. So your argument is much stronger in that case. And so we basically, if you look at individual cases, you will also always look at actors and their interaction, and international actors and domestic actors. So you will look from a multi-level perspective and a perspective including state and non-state actors into how the existence or the adoption, the prior adoption of a policy in other countries, how this affects the possibilities of actors, their influence, their ability to be heard by decision makers, etc. I don't know if that answers your question, but in any case, it's actors are always crucial, actors and their interests. But here we are looking at a global dynamic that changes the potential influence of actors over time, and this is, I think, the interesting thing that can develop dynamics of mutual reinforcement of individual policy adoptions.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. It does help.
Thank you very much, Jose Manuel and Helge. And if you please could help me like raising your hands in this Zoom app for me to be listening the participations. And now we will have the participation of Isik from Madrid, but she's based in Chile or something like that. So if you could please, Isik, and all of you to help me introducing yourself, because Helge does not. So Helge could have an idea of who's talking with, and please, Isik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Israel. So I'm actually like, I'm from the Carlos III University of Madrid. I'm in Chile for 2 months for a research stay. So I'm doing some research on climate policy here, adoption, implementation. So then my question is on vertical and horizontal nature of adoption. So that's very interesting. And as we know, in a lot of countries in the global south, so de facto implementation is quite challenging. So if adoption is there, de jure, you have the formal rules of the game, and you have quite fancy laws, and but then you have hard time to implement them for various reasons. So I wonder if the likelihood of implementation would increase if the diffusion takes place through horizontal means, through horizontal sort of dynamics. So that is one thing. And the second is that, so several countries in the global south, so including Chile, Mexico, Turkey, so they're part of the OECD, but they're on the margins of the OECD. They're outliers of OECD. OECD has been very important in policy diffusion, actually. But then when it comes to implementation, the story is quite different. So, and the research actually quite sort of is deficient on that front as well. So what do you think about that? So part of OECD, but not really OECD. And the other question on horizontal, vertical, and implementation results. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That's a very interesting question. did a research project some time ago together with a couple of colleagues, with Christoph Knil and Andrea Rencho, Duncan Liefering colleagues, on the convergence of environmental policies in Europe. And in order not to look only at EU member states, we included a couple of countries that were outside of the EU. And Mexico was one of the countries. And what we found here, and that is exactly what you were saying, is that there is a big difference between policy adoption and policy implementation. And we have countries which adopt policies, but then refrain from thoroughly implementing these policies. And while we had a first part of the project, which was a quantitative study, which looked at adoptions and policy changes over time with regard to many environmental policies, and also environmental the settings or the instruments used within these policies. The second part focused on a couple of case studies. And in these case studies, we found, for example, that in Mexico, there was a big pressure from multinational corporations to adopt strict environmental standards. And the government did adopt these standards, but then only implemented them with regard to multinational corporations, but not to small national companies or economic actors. So there was a kind of a two-level system of implementation. One was because these multilateral corporations didn't want to be shamed as actors who engage in eco-dumping and go to countries with weak environmental regulations. So they didn't want that. And so they wanted the government to at least have these regulations in place. But then again, they weren't too interested in implementation. And the government also didn't want to raise the cost for the very small and not very competitive national small companies. And so we had this system. That was one of the findings we had there, and that was independent of whether the diffusion process was horizontal, or whether it was more vertical, or whether it was international agreements or not, because we looked at both types of cases. And we didn't have very many cases, so it's not a very reliable finding. But we didn't find a big difference here with regard to this pattern of adoption, yes, implementation only in a rather weak manner. So yes, there's no clear link between adoption and implementation, and also. We didn't see whether the one dynamic was better for motivating actors to engage in implementation than the other. We didn't see anything there. Let me see. I don't know, but I think your two questions were a bit related. I don't know if there's anything that
They were. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Isik, and also thank you for being here, and thank you, Helge. And now is the time for the participation of Jorge Guzman, a student associated to this project. Please, Jorge.
Thank you, Israel. It's a great pleasure to meet you, Dr. Jörgens. I have two questions. First, you mentioned that the policy diffusion is a voluntary adoption of a policy, but still concerned that that way, then I don't know how to say. But I still consider that the way when there is some kind of coercion from a more authoritative body, such as the European Community institutions, and that's the first question. And do you think there is a forced diffusion of environmental policy from European countries to Latin America, even through they belong to different epistemic communities with perhaps different policy needs. Let me explain. We tend to make for granted without questioning that adopting and adapting the British Climate Act was a good thing for Mexico, for example.
Yeah. Well, let me look at the first one. That's, of course, always an analytic decision whether to code an adoption as voluntary or coerced, because actually you have a continuum, and you have a little bit of coercion, a little bit more, etc. So what we did in our research was to really look at it in a more formal way. If there was an international agreement and international negotiations with a binding, some kind of binding agreement, then we would say, okay, this is clearly not a case of diffusion, but it's a case of international cooperation and harmonization. And also we looked at whether there were any instances of coercion, financial coercion, especially because you don't have military coercion in the environmental field, or you don't. We didn't encounter any of that, but you have financial coercion in the case of, for example, grants by the World Bank, also which obliged countries to make a sustainability strategy in order to apply for a grant or to implement, to introduce a framework for environmental impact assessment at the national level. Without that, they wouldn't apply for, wouldn't be eligible for certain financial aids and grants. And so what we could see a clear case of this kind of conditionality, or the accession to the European Union, and the European Union having an environmental law in place, and other countries adopting the same during the process of accession. Then we would code this as forced or coerced or binding adoption. And if this wasn't the case, then we would look whether there was some kind of interdependence. So whether in the decision-making process, actors referred to some other country or to some model that was communicated by an international organization, but not legally binding for them, when they made the decision about it to adopt a certain policy. So this was basically a methodological approach. And of course, there's always some coercion going on. And of course, there's always a power asymmetry between, for example, the European Union and other countries, smaller countries in the European neighborhood. And there's always, even if the accession process hasn't started, there's always a motivation for other countries to make their own policies similar to the European Union policies in order to apply, maybe at a later stage, for membership also. So yeah, it's difficult to make this decision, and you can argue about almost every decision we made here. But it's important to think about these general categories and make a categorical difference here, although we know that the reality is more complex. With regard to whether it's helpful or not, we didn't really look into that, because and this would also be a good venue for research, to see whether these processes of policy learning or policy transfer or policy imitation, whether they really improve policies. And of course, we can think about the diffusion of bad policies, and I think this is increasing. You can see the diffusion of symbolic policies, or even of policies or policy decisions that weaken the response to a collective problem. We can think about that, and it's of course possible. So not everything that diffuses is positive in terms of our capacity to respond to pressing problems. And then there's the question of whether something that works in one country, in one setting, will actually work in another one. So you always have, and I think the literature on lesson drawing by Richard Rose and others, they already focused on that very early, and they said that there are different degrees of policy transfer. You can really imitate something, you can copy something, but it goes all the way down to inspiration. And inspiration means that you look at the general logic of a policy, but then adapt it totally, change it, and adapt it to the national context of the adopting kind of the receiving country. So you can think about that. And I wouldn't say that, I would never say or argue, and the research also doesn't show this, that you should copy something word by word from another country. It usually doesn't make much sense. But you should look at what's the logic of the policy, what's whether it has been effective, and if so, why it has been effective, and try to save these elements that are responsible for policy's effectiveness and maybe translate them to a different national context. But this is one of the things that really the research project is really interesting about, because you can look at a relatively small number of cases, and within these small numbers of cases, you can ask all these kinds of questions, and on the one hand see what has changed in the process of transfer. You can also look at mechanisms. What are the motivations for actors to learn or adopt a policy that is in place somewhere else? But you can also look at how this policy changes over time, and what are the elements that remain, and what are the elements that are being weakened, and which additional elements maybe are incorporated in the policy. And for this, it's interesting, if you look at climate acts, to really look into what are the essential characteristics or elements of a climate act, and then look at whether these elements are in place in different countries. And we can already see this in Europe, within European countries, that some of the elements, for example, public participation, which is one of the elements in the UK Act, but doesn't appear or isn't taken seriously in some other acts. And so then the other thing, a binding, legally binding carbon neutrality target, and the year when this target has to be reached. This is also something that is not present in all the climate acts, but it's an essential element. One of the big logics of climate acts is to really not only make a statement of intention by a government that can be revoked by the next government, but actually to have a policy or a target that is legally grounded, and where you have to actually find majorities to change the law in order to revoke this target. And this can be changed, of course, and some countries may drop this legally binding character of the target in their climate acts. So this is interesting to look at differences, how it changes over time, what happens in the process of policy transfer, and also how different elements that work in one political context may not work in another one. I think lots of good questions here.
Thank you.
Helge and Jorge, and please, the word is for Dahila Gonzalez. If you can present yourself, please.
Good morning. Wait a minute, please.
Yes. Yes, Dayla. Okay, and if meanwhile, if the rest of the participants would like to raise their hands, if they would have a participation, it would be very helpful for me.
Good morning. I am Vale Gonzalez. I am student for.
Sorry, Dayla, we hear you like, I don't know the rest of you, but it's like really, really far away.
Ah.
If you could get closer to the microphone.
But it's okay.
Not really. If you could probably speak louder, más fuerte.
Well. Good morning. I am Daria Gonzalez. I am from Mexico City. I am from UNAM, and I am a student of science communication. And I have a question, is how as citizens, but specifically like students, we can have influence in this kind of policy transfers against the interests of the big corporations and private interests. But specifically like as students.
Okay, thank
Sorry,
you.
I
Yeah,
couldn't really.
Yeah, sorry, Dayla. It's like something, algo como, como estudiantes, ¿qué podemos hacer en el policy transfer o cómo fue?
Bueno, puedo hacer la pregunta en español.
Sí,
Me
sí, sí.
refiero que nosotros como estudiantes, ¿qué podemos hacer en este tipo de cosas? ¿De qué manera nosotros podemos inferir? ¿Y cómo podemos anteponer nuestros derechos o nuestros intereses como ciudadanos? Pero no nuestros intereses, sino nuestros derechos como ciudadanos ante muchas corporaciones que lo que quieren es beneficiarse de las lagunas que hay o que suele haber en estas políticas, porque muchos suelen interferir pues en la creación de estas mismas políticas.
Yes, thank you. So basically, Helge, if I will try to translate a little bit, if sometimes corporations or some enterprises, they influence the development of these pieces of legislation that are diffuse. So the question basically is like how citizens, since she's a student and she's concerned about the possible negative impacts of the different policies, how citizens could influence or otherwise avoid this negative influence from part of international corporations in order not to implement bad policies in the national legislation. It's something like that, right, Dalila? Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think basically it's well, this is not the main focus of the policy analytical approach to policy diffusion, but it's maybe very related to what I said before, that as citizens you can easily get information about best practices and what really the best available policies in a given area look like and what their main elements are. And you can get this information also from international networks that are active in different areas of policy making, environmental policy making. And so you can confront in public hearings and in any kind of participatory mechanisms that you may have in policy making, you can confront policymakers with this information and with these ideas about what the best available policy would look like. And you can use this information in order to then call out attempts by industry, by other actors to water down the substance of a policy. So I think the diffusion perspective also gives you a possibility to get a broader idea of what is possible and then not go for second best or not accept watered down policies, but say, well, but we have examples of really good and ambitious policies, and why don't we do this here in our country? So I think it's the same logic, basically.
Thank you, Helge. Well, I think that the time is kind of running out, and I don't want to abuse of Helge's time. So I would say that probably to have at least 3 more questions. And if you don't mind, I would like to ask Karen and Itzcoatl to present themselves and ask their question, and then to give Helge the turn to reply. And afterwards, I will, if you don't mind, I will make the final question, because it's important for the research project. And then we will give Helge some time to make some closing remarks. Okay, so please, first Karen, and then Itzcoatl, if you can make your questions and in row, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this space, Professor Jörgens. I have a very a quick question. I'm a communication professor, and my question is about that. What's your opinion about the influence of the mass media and even the social media into these environmental policies? For example, I remember a very popular and very viral video about a turtle with a straw in her nose, and after that, the Mexican government launched a very strong communication campaign to provide the plastic bags and the plastics of a single use. Is it very common? I mean, is it very common that the government responds for a special communication and social media pressure about this kind of matters? Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And please, Itzcoatl.
Thank you. Thank you, Isra, for the invitation, and thank you, Dr. Jörgens, for your presentation. I have a very quick question about how the autonomy of the national states intervene in the policy diffusion, especially with, well, I work on climate adaptation, which is like a very, it responds to very particular conditions in the local level. So in this on this sense, I would like to ask you how the autonomy of the different scales within the national state have intervened, and how have you observed these conditions, if you have done this kind of research. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Itzcoatl.
both.
Please, Helge.
First of all, to Karen, yes, I haven't really done a lot of research on the mass media or social media as an actor in diffusion processes. Of course, there's good reason to believe that they play a role, and I think what I've looked into a little bit is the diffusion of what you also mentioned, the diffusion of plastic bag bans or taxes on plastic bags and throwaway plastic bags. And here, I think the social media play a role, and the media, because it's a very easy to communicate, very visible problem. I mean, everybody who comes home from the supermarket with lots of plastic bags and throws them away feels like we shouldn't be doing this, and so it's very close to the people and very easy to communicate. And governments are very receptive for this kind of policy of plastic bag bans, because they don't really change anything. They don't really change anything because the plastic bags are only a very minor fraction of of the plastic pollution that we are facing, and especially in Europe. So I'm not talking about countries, especially those countries that are having a good waste management system in place. It's not the same in Bangladesh, which doesn't have such a good waste management system, and where plastic bags really constituted a big problem, environmental problem, and also go into the oceans, etc. But in countries, it was interesting to see that in European countries with all kinds of policies in place and waste management systems and management systems for plastic waste, etc., that they are so receptive to this kind of question. And that's exactly because governments are not only problem solvers, but they're also vote seekers. So they want to win the next elections. They want to convince people to vote for them during the next elections. And this is these easy to frame problems that don't mean where the policies don't mean that you really change dramatically the industrial structure of a country. Those are great areas where governments can show that they are concerned without really paying a huge cost for the policies they adopt. So the mass media and the social media can also easily frame this with pictures of plastic bags and birds with the plastic bag over their head and so on. This works quite well and accelerates diffusion processes. The problem is that other areas where you have long-term contaminations of soils or so, you can't frame them so well in the mass media, and they're probably problems that are much more pressing and much more important, and yet political action and also diffusion processes are slower because of the low visibility of this kind of problems. Regarding the second question, well, basically, we can think about diffusion processes at different levels of government, or also as a multi-level dynamic, where you have countries. Countries are organized in international organizations or international treaty systems. And then within a country, you have the federal states with a certain autonomy, bigger in some countries, smaller in other countries. And you also have the municipalities, etc. And here, in theory, there can also be a blockade. So if you look at veto player theory, then you have this argument that the more actors you have in a political system who can say no to a policy adoption, the less likely policy change becomes. And so there can actually be a blockade. But then you can also look at countries, for example, the United States, where you had for several periods, you had presidents and executives who tried to block all kind of renewable energy and energy transition and climate policy. But in those systems, policy didn't come to a stop because it went on at the state level. So the state level may also be a source of a dynamic. I think you have to look at individual cases. I don't think there's an overall general rule that you can apply to any system. It can be a positive dynamic, and it can also be a negative dynamic with regard to the division of autonomy and power among different levels of government. So no clear answer, but it's a good question, and it's something you have to look at, especially if you do case studies and if you do in-depth case studies. It's very important.
Well, thank you, Helge. I have two questions, and to be honest, I am asking you this as a sort of guru for us in terms of understanding policy diffusion. And the first one is related to the North-South dynamic. And let me first put a little bit of background in this. Actually, the three case studies that we are studying, Mexico, Peru, and Chile, they are a sort of good students in terms of international climate politics, right? And there is a clearly north-south dynamic when these countries have adopted these policies. I've spoken to people from the Mexican Congress, and they said sort of we make a sort of tropicalization of the UK Climate Change Act. And colleagues from Chile, they have told us also like sort of there is a kind of colonial mind in Chile that makes us think that it's better a legislative piece if it comes from Europe rather than other places in the world. But at the same time, we are now noticing a South-South dynamic in the sense that Mexico has influenced the Peruvian Climate Act, and then we don't know probably there is influence from Mexico and Peru in the cases of Chile, in the case of Chile. So at least what do you think that it's one of our most potential contributions in the sense of policy diffusion literature in relation to the North-South dynamic? Where should we be looking at, what factors we should be looking at in terms of understanding this dynamic within the international global negotiations and governance? I don't know if I explain myself correctly. It's just that I think that this North-South dynamic, it's interesting, but I don't know how we could actually make a contribution to the literature. And the second one, and I perfectly know that it's not part of the policy diffusion literature, but then we have something like a so what question, right? Like in Latin America, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Paraguay, these all countries have adopted policy acts, climate acts, but then nothing has happened. And I think it's difficult if we limit our research project just to policy diffusion and not to to study implementation, because then we will not satisfy like the national needs and noticing how we advancing. So basically my question is, how do you recommend to connect the literature on policy diffusion with the literature on policy implementation to not only answer these policy diffusion traditional questions, but also to say what is going on and what's working and what's not working? And of course, thank you very much for your very insightful presentation and for being part of this project, Helge. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thanks a lot. Very good questions and no easy answers. So I think in the course of the research project, we will have to come up with good answers here. But regarding the North-South dynamic, on the one hand, I mean, you could have different theoretical expectations. You could expect that the UK Climate Framework Act, which is generally considered within the climate policy community as a model. You can basically formulate the hypothesis that this act is equally visible to all countries, you know, also in the global south. So basically, you could expect a diffusion process that where different countries look to the UK case and try to emulate it, try to do something similar. And then you could also look at what other studies in the diffusion literature have shown, and also this very early study by Jack Walker in 1969 in the United States already showed this, that there are different states that are references for their geographical part of the United States. So basically, you have a diffusion process that starts with some country or some state that innovates, that develops a new policy that nobody has ever had before, and then you have in different regions of the United States, you have early adopters, and those become regional pioneers or regional reference points. And then other countries in the region don't look at the country that the state that initially developed or invented a policy, but they look at their regional reference state. And this would be more in line with what you said, that Mexico is clearly influenced by the UK case, but then that other countries like Peru, for example, look to Mexico and not to the UK as a reference. So this could be interesting, to see what kinds of pattern of diffusion we can find here. And also try to understand what the reasons are. I mean, why doesn't Peru look also to the UK? Why do they maybe look to a bad translation of the UK and instead of looking to the original? And that would be interesting to find out. So I think looking, first of all, describing the patterns of diffusion, and then asking why the pattern is like this and not different, I think would make an interesting contribution here. And of course, I think you will find more while looking at the different case studies or national case studies. You will probably come up with other surprising observations that need explanation. With regard to implementation, I think it's important, and if you have few cases, then you can look at implementation. If you have lots of cases, if you're looking at like Per Olof and I did, if you look at 45 countries or even at 180 countries globally, you can't look into implementation, and you can't really look at how these policies then are being translated and implemented in the different countries and whether they're effective or not. If you look at only a few countries, you can do that, and you can link the two. And I think it's important. I mean, it's always a question of whether you have the capacities of doing some kind of research. And if you're focusing on large patterns of diffusion, then implementation is more difficult to study in an equally systematic way. But that doesn't mean it's not important, because there are lots of other studies that look at implementation. And if you link the two, it would also actually be interesting. Now, the question is how. On the one hand, you could argue that, like we said earlier on, that if the adoption of a policy occurs for reasons of corresponding to norms of good governance and, making it showing a good image of one's own country, then we could argue that probably implementation is not the priority of this government. So they just want to do this symbolic move of adopting a policy innovation because they just look better in the environmental community and community of environmental states, and within the climate negotiations, the UNFCCC negotiations. They just look better if they have a climate act. But they're not really interested in implementing them. So then if you really find this, okay. But if you find that a country that's not really interested in implementing is after a while actually making an effort and changing or revising the act and incorporating more stringent and ambitious content into this act, then this could also mean that this diffusion, even if it's superficial and only for normative reasons, that it then creates a point of reference which actors at the national level can use in order to strengthen their own interests and their own policy preferences, and making a stronger argument for their own policy preferences. So there could be a dynamic that initially implementation is not the focus, but then over time, the existence of such a climate act creates a venue for actors who want to strengthen it and strengthen also its implementation. But that depends on the case studies. But I think it's interesting to look at both, at the two dimensions of adoption and implementation. Just like in the policy cycle, we look at policy formulation and decision, and then we look at implementation, and then we look at evaluation and policy revision and policy change. Then you could also do this here and maybe find some interesting dynamics that go beyond the pessimistic view of, we're just only adopting a policy in a symbolic way, but we never intend to and never will really do anything to implement them. Both could be interesting findings.
Thank you, Helge. I think that Isik wants to jump into this discussion, and then please take the word to giving us some final remarks, Helge. Go ahead, Isik, please.
Yeah, thank you, Israel. So I know that we're almost out of time, but then I've been doing some research here in Chile about the Climate Act, and I've been talking to the actors who got involved in the legal teams and so on. So I wanted to make a comment on South to South diffusion. And they went through, they say that they went through the Mexican Climate Act, and they sort of like took some parts of the Mexican Climate Act as the anti-role model. And so anti-role model in the sense that sort of lacking clear mandates and lacking capacity, particularly budgets. And that's quite interesting. And also I wanted to mention something that the role of the UK Climate Act went beyond, I guess, as the role model of the Climate Act itself, but then the UK embassy played quite important roles in several countries, in Latin America especially. So quite a protagonist after diffusion of the Climate Acts and also promotion of the UK model, the UK Climate Act. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Isik. Really, really helpful for the research, and I hope you could integrate into the research project as well. So please talk with Ceci
Sure,
afterwards.
we can talk, yeah.
Yeah. And please, Helge, closing remarks.
Yeah, no, I don't have any closing remarks, but just
final words.
The last by Isik, the last observation. We also observed that the UK embassies are very strong in promoting their own environmental policy approaches and providing information, making all kinds of events which serve for information sharing and so on. And it's very strong. There was a time when in Berlin we had 3 people working at the embassy only in the environmental field and only organizing environmental stuff, and they were former students of our masters in environmental policy. So that was really a big difference to many of the other countries where the embassies are not really very much involved in environmental policy making and promoting the national approach to environmental policy making. And then the UK is one of the leaders in climate policy, one of the few countries that really make significant progress, and so they also want to share this with other countries. I think that's one, for example, one of the mechanisms that are not visible in all cases, but that make this case very special and which is very interesting. On a more general stance, I don't know. I'm not going to try to summarize anything here, but I think it's a great project. I'm really glad that you're doing this on the diffusion and possibly also implementation of climate acts in a series of Latin American countries. That will be very interesting in terms of case studies. There's more research on European countries so far, and I think what we should also try is to bring them together, the research on European countries and the European diffusion processes with the ones in Mexico, Peru, Chile, and other countries in the Americas, which is very interesting then. So yeah, I look forward to cooperating and to seeing also the more of your results, but looks very interesting. And at the same time, I'm trying to also do some work on European countries and climate policy diffusion in Europe. So I hopefully will come up with a paper in a couple of months, and then we can also get together and discuss this. Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. It was great, and thanks a lot for all the very interesting insights from your part.
Thank you very much for being part of this second webinar of the research project. Thank you, colleagues, students. Thank you, Helge. And please follow our social media, basically on Twitter, now X, that it's Andes Clima, so you can be aware of our following session. And again, thank you, Helge. It was a pleasure to have you here. It's always nice to listen to your research on policy diffusion, and I think that it has been very insightful for our research project. And have a nice day. And for those who are in Mexico, please enjoy the solar eclipse. Bye bye.